funeral homes. They stand as silent sentinels at the edge of life and death, buildings draped in a perpetual twilight of grief and remembrance. To many, they are merely places of somber ritual, where the living bid their final goodbyes to the departed, where tears flow freely and hushed whispers fill the air. Yet beneath the veneer of quiet dignity and professional solace, these institutions often harbor stories far more unsettling than the sorrow they are built to contain. Not all departures are peaceful, and sometimes the boundary between this world and the next blurs, leaving behind echoes of something truly horrifying. It is within these shadowed halls, where the veil between realms is thinnest, that tales emerge which challenge our understanding of death itself. One such story begins with Elias, a man whose life was inextricably linked to these solemn spaces. Elias was an embalmer, a craftsman of the morbid, his hands moving with a practiced grace, born of years spent preparing the deceased for their final presentation. He was a stoic figure, his face often etched with a quiet intensity, but beneath that calm exterior lay a profound respect for the dead. For Elias, his work was not merely a job, it was a sacred duty, a final act of care to ensure that each soul could transition peacefully, that each body was treated with the dignity it deserved before its earthly journey concluded. He believed in providing peace both for the deceased and for the grieving families left behind. The unsettling arrival began on a particularly dreary Tuesday evening. The body, belonging to a local eccentric known for his reclusive nature, was wheeled into Elias's preparation room. As Elias began his meticulous work, a shiver, not of cold, but of something far more primal, traced its way down his spine. The deceased presented with unnatural signs. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to emanate from the corpse itself, a sound that Elias initially dismissed as the hum of the ventilation system or the creaking of the old building. He told himself it was fatigue, the long hours finally catching up to him, yet an undeniable feeling of being watched crept into his awareness, a sensation that persisted despite the empty room save for himself and the silent form on the table. As the hours wore on, the unease deepened. A surgical tool, moments ago resting firmly on the stainless steel tray, clattered to the floor with a metallic ring, though Elias was certain he hadn't touched it. Then a sudden, inexplicable cold spot manifested directly beside him, raising the fine hairs on his arms despite the consistent warmth of the room. He paused, his breath catching in his throat, and glanced around, his eyes scanning the sterile surfaces, finding nothing amiss. He rationalized it as a draft, a quirk of the aging facility, but the explanation felt hollow, inadequate to quell the growing prickle of fear. A growing suspicion began to take root in Elias's mind, an unwelcome thought that fought against his ingrained professionalism and scientific training. This wasn't just a body, something lingered here, a presence that defied all logic, all reason. His respect for the dead was being tested by an entity that refused to rest. The air grew heavy, thick with a presence that wasn't meant to be there, a palpable weight that pressed down on him, whispering of secrets and unrest. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his quiet evening had just taken a profoundly sinister turn. Elias's deepening concern transformed into an almost obsessive quest for answers. He meticulously re-examined the preparation room, checking every vent, every window, every possible source of a draft or an errant sound, but found nothing that could logically explain the phenomena. The tools continued their unsettling dance, sometimes merely shifting, other times flung with surprising force across the room. The cold spots intensified, moving with an intelligence that defied atmospheric physics, often settling directly behind him, a chilling embrace that left him trembling. He tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to overworked nerves or an overactive imagination, yet the evidence of his senses was irrefutable. Rational explanations failed him, leaving an unnerving void where his scientific understanding once resided. Driven by a nascent fear, Elias began to discreetly investigate the deceased man's past. He spoke with the few neighbors who knew the recluse, piecing together a mosaic of isolated cruelty and bitterness. The man, a former landlord, had been known for his vindictive nature, his petty tyrannies, and a particular penchant for ruining the lives of those he deemed beneath him. Whispers of unpaid debts, broken promises, and a legacy of suffering followed his name. Elias learned of a specific incident, a family evicted on a whim, their lives shattered, their desperate pleas met with cold amusement. A grim realization dawned on Elias. This wasn't just a lingering presence, it was a vengeful spirit, tethered to the earthly plane by the very suffering it had inflicted. The manifestation intensified, no longer content with subtle disturbances. Objects were now openly thrown, sometimes just missing Elias, crashing against the walls with terrifying force. Disembodied voices, faint and guttural, whispered his name, their tones laced with an ancient fury. Elias found himself speaking aloud, pleading with the unseen entity to find peace, to move on. But his words were met with a fresh onslaught of chaos. His internal conflict raged. His professionalism demanded a calm, composed demeanor, but his primal fear screamed for him to flee. He was an embalmer, not an exorcist, yet here he was, locked in a macabre dance with the supernatural. The funeral home itself seemed to hum with an oppressive energy. Elias, now desperate, delved into the building's archives, seeking any precedent for such occurrences. He unearthed old newspaper clippings, faded photographs and ledgers detailing past services. He found whispers of past tragedies, forgotten secrets, a strange fire decades ago, an unexplained disappearance, even a few cryptic entries about unrest within the walls. The building, he realized, was not merely a structure. It was a silent witness, its history laden with its own spectral baggage. He confided in his only colleague, Martha, a seasoned funeral assistant, whose cynicism was as sharp as her wit. Martha, initially sympathetic, quickly dismissed Elias's claims as stress and overwork. "You've been spending too much time alone with the dead, Elias," she'd said, her voice laced with concern but ultimately tinged with skepticism. "Get some rest. You're imagining things." Her disbelief only isolated Elias further, solidifying his conviction that he was facing this terrifying reality alone. The spiritual attack escalated from psychological torment to physical assault. One night, as Elias prepared another body, a searing cold enveloped him, followed by a violent shove that sent him sprawling across the tiled floor. He felt an invisible hand close around his throat, squeezing, cutting off his breath. Panic seized him as he clawed at the empty air, his vision blurring. Just as he felt consciousness slipping away, the pressure abruptly released, leaving him gasping, his throat raw, his body aching. This was no longer a haunting. It was a direct threat. Elias's resolve hardened. He was no longer just preparing the dead. He was fighting for the living, for himself and perhaps for the future peace of this very funeral home. He knew he couldn't simply walk away. He had to confront this malevolent force. Days later, while cleaning out an old storage cabinet in the embalming room, he made a chilling discovery. Tucked away behind dusty bottles and forgotten medical supplies, he found a small leather-bound journal. Its pages, brittle with age, detailed similar occurrences, written in a shaky hand by a former embalmer decades prior. The entries spoke of the unrest, the vengeful spirit, and a desperate, failed attempt to seal the malice. The final entry was simply a single stark word: trapped. Elias understood then that he was not the first to face this horror, and he certainly wouldn't be the last unless he acted. The chilling discovery of the journal left Elias with a profound sense of dread, but also a grim determination. Yet, his fight was only one battle in the silent war that often raged within these solemn walls. Elsewhere, in a funeral home of a different era, another story began to unfold, woven with threads of familial discord and spectral intervention. This was the narrative of Sarah, a young funeral director, whose motivations were steeped in legacy and an innate empathy for the grieving. Her family's business, established generations ago, was her inheritance, a weighty mantle she wore with pride and dedication. She saw her role not just as a profession, but as a sacred trust, a final act of respect for the deceased, and a source of comfort for those left behind. Sarah approached each new case with a gentle solemnity, her hands steady as she arranged flowers, her voice soft as she offered condolences. But the peace she sought to cultivate was often fragile, easily shattered by the raw edges of human emotion. Her latest case involved the seemingly peaceful passing of an elderly matriarch, a woman named Eleanor Vance. On the surface, Eleanor's death appeared natural, a quiet surrender to old age. However, beneath this veneer of tranquility, a storm of bitterness brewed among her surviving family members. Two adult children, a son and a daughter, were locked in a silent, simmering feud, their grief overshadowed by years of resentment and unspoken grievances. From the moment Eleanor's body arrived, a subtle disquiet began to permeate the funeral home. It started innocuously enough. A framed photograph of Eleanor, placed carefully on a side table for the viewing, would inexplicably tilt, then fall, shattering its glass. Sarah, ever practical, attributed it to vibrations from passing traffic or an unstable shelf. Then, during the first visitation, the lights in the main parlor began to flicker erratically, plunging the room into momentary darkness before blazing back to life. A shiver traced its way down Sarah's spine, but she quickly dismissed it as faulty wiring, a common problem in the older sections of the building. She was a woman of reason, firmly grounded in the tangible world, and such minor disturbances were easily rationalized. Yet as the days progressed, the disturbances escalated, mirroring the increasing animosity between Eleanor's children. Their hushed arguments in the hallway grew louder, their strained politeness giving way to thinly veiled accusations. It was as though the very air of the funeral home was charged with their unresolved conflict, and something unseen was feeding on it. During the wake, as the family gathered for a final farewell, the manifestations became more direct, more terrifying. A vase of lilies, placed reverently beside the casket, suddenly toppled, scattering water and petals across the polished floor, narrowly missing Eleanor's daughter. A cold, inexplicable draft swept through the room, causing the memorial candles to extinguish in unison, plunging the parlor into an eerie gloom. The son, standing near the casket, gasped as an unseen force seemed to press against his chest, making him recoil in fright. Sarah watched these events unfold, her initial dismissals crumbling under the weight of mounting evidence. This was no longer faulty wiring or unstable shelves. This was something else entirely, something deeply unsettling. A chilling realization dawned on her. The spirit of Eleanor Vance was not at peace. It was inextricably tied to the unresolved earthly conflict of her children, a silent, spectral witness to their bitterness and betrayal. The deceased were not just resting, they were demanding justice, their silent pleas echoing through the very fabric of the funeral home. Sarah, despite her growing unease, held on to the hope that reason could prevail, that a heartfelt conversation might quell the turbulent energy that now permeated her funeral home. She attempted to mediate between Eleanor's children, Julian and Clara, during a particularly tense moment in the director's office. Her words, however, seemed to fall on deaf ears, or perhaps they were merely fuel to the unseen entity that thrived on their discord. As Sarah spoke of reconciliation and respect for their mother's memory, a chilling whisper slithered through the seemingly empty room, barely audible, yet undeniably present. It spoke of betrayal, a soft, venomous accusation that seemed to emanate from the very walls, directed not at Sarah but at the siblings. The whispers intensified, growing bolder, intertwining with the frantic energy of the feuding family. Julian, usually composed, began to pace, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an invisible accuser. Clara clutched her hands to her chest, her face paling as the unseen presence seemed to draw closer. It was then, amidst the escalating supernatural phenomena, that the true source of Eleanor's unrest began to reveal itself. Sarah remembered a cryptic comment from Eleanor's lawyer about a sealed envelope, to be opened only after the funeral. With a sudden, intuitive dread, she retrieved it from the secure safe where it had been placed for safekeeping. Inside, carefully folded, was Eleanor Vance's true last will and testament. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read its contents aloud, her voice strained. The document revealed a shocking twist. Eleanor had explicitly disinherited Julian, leaving the vast majority of her estate, including the family home, to Clara alone. The reason, stated in Eleanor's own elegant script, was a long-held secret of financial deceit and betrayal on Julian's part, a transgression Eleanor had discovered only in her final months. A stunned silence descended upon the room, thicker and more suffocating than any of the previous disturbances. Clara looked from the document to her brother, a mixture of shock and vindication on her face. Julian, however, reacted with a primal roar of denial, his features contorted in disbelief and rage. He accused Clara of forging the document, of manipulating their mother. But the air around him grew colder, the whispers now a chorus of condemnation, swirling around him like an invisible tempest. He stumbled backward, clutching his head, his eyes wide with terror, as the spectral accusations seemed to claw at his very sanity. The spirit's power, fueled by this explosive revelation and Julian's raw anguish, surged. The lights in the office flickered violently, then exploded, showering them with glass. The framed pictures on the wall twisted and fell, their glass shattering, mirroring the fragmentation of the family. Julian screamed, not in anger but in pure, unadulterated fear, as he saw fleeting, horrifying images. His mother's disapproving face, her eyes burning with an otherworldly fire, her spectral hands reaching for him. He was experiencing vivid, terrifying hallucinations, a direct psychic assault from the vengeful entity. Sarah watched, her heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out on her brow. She wanted to intervene to protect them, yet a profound fear rooted her to the spot. This was beyond her understanding, beyond her capabilities. The raw power of the spirit was overwhelming, a tangible force of righteous indignation. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the spirit sought not merely acknowledgement, but a profound resolution, a true accounting for the betrayal that had scarred Eleanor's final days. Desperate, Sarah tried to appeal to whatever remained of their humanity. She pleaded for them to acknowledge the truth, to seek forgiveness, to bring peace to their mother's tormented spirit. But Julian was too consumed by terror, Clara by a mix of grief and bitter triumph. The confrontation reached its horrifying climax as Julian, in a fit of terror-driven rage, lunged at Clara, accusing her of engineering his downfall. He believed he was fighting her, but his flailing arms passed through her, instead striking the air as if battling an unseen adversary. The spirit, no longer content with whispers and illusions, manifested with terrifying clarity. A chilling, spectral form, vaguely resembling Eleanor, solidified for a fleeting moment behind Julian, its eyes burning with an infernal light. It was a terrifying, silent scream of vengeance, directed squarely at him. Julian collapsed, his body racked with convulsions, his mind shattered by the direct assault. The bonds of blood were poisoned, and the dead refused to stay silent. The funeral home, once a sanctuary of solemn farewells, had become a battleground for a family's tormented past, and Sarah, a reluctant witness, knew she was utterly out of her depth. The lingering echoes of the spectral confrontation gradually faded, leaving Sarah trembling amidst the shattered glass and lingering scent of fear. The funeral home, now eerily silent, felt heavier, imbued with the raw pain of the family's fractured past. Julian lay incoherent, his terror-stricken eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, while Clara, though shaken, seemed to find a grim satisfaction in the spectral justice meted out. Sarah realized, with a profound sense of exhaustion, that her role in this particular tragedy was over. The dead had spoken and the living had been irrevocably altered. She had to move on to the next somber chapter, hoping for a return to the quiet dignity that funeral homes were meant to embody. Her next assignment brought her to a different facility, miles away from the city's chaotic energy. This funeral home was a sprawling, older structure, nestled deep within a dense forest, its stone facade perpetually cloaked in shadow. It was here that Mark, a night watchman, began his nightly vigil. Mark was a man etched with the weariness of life, his face a roadmap of past mistakes and regrets. His motivation was simple, yet profound: to provide for his family, to atone for youthful indiscretions that still haunted his waking thoughts. The isolation of the place was both a blessing and a curse. It offered solitude, but also amplified every creak and groan of the old building. On his very first shift, the strange occurrences began. Unexplained noises echoed from the empty chapels, floorboards groaned where no one walked, and fleeting shadows danced at the periphery of his vision. Mark, a man who had seen his share of darkness in the world, initially dismissed them as products of an overactive imagination, fueled by the oppressive silence and the loneliness of the job. He attributed the cold spots to drafts, the whispers to the wind whistling through ancient eaves. Yet an undeniable unease began to settle in his gut, a primal instinct screaming that something was amiss. One night, during a routine patrol of the sprawling complex, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of light drew his attention to a section of the building he hadn't yet explored. Behind a dusty, forgotten tapestry, he discovered a hidden door, camouflaged perfectly within the aged wood paneling. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, compelled him to push it open. The door groaned, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase leading downwards into an oppressive darkness. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a small, forgotten chapel. It was unlike any other room in the funeral home, its air thick with an ancient, stagnant energy. The altar was made of rough-hewn stone, not polished marble, and strange, faded symbols adorned the walls, half obscured by centuries of dust and neglect. Whispers of the chapel's sinister history began to surface in his mind, tales he'd overheard from the older staff during a brief orientation, rumors of dark rituals, forbidden practices, and unspeakable acts that had taken place within its walls long ago. A shiver, colder than any draft, ran down his spine. The growing sense of dread intensified, morphing into a palpable fear. This wasn't merely an old forgotten room. It was a place imbued with a malevolent presence, a darkness tied inextricably to its very foundations. He felt an unseen force watching him, its gaze heavy and predatory. As he stood there, frozen by an inexplicable terror, the air suddenly grew heavy, suffocating. The temperature plummeted, and a guttural growl, not human, but undeniably sentient, rumbled from the shadows. Before he could react, an unseen force slammed into him, sending him sprawling against the cold stone floor. He cried out, scrambling to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt icy tendrils grasp at his ankles, a searing pain coursing through his leg. This wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. He was being physically accosted by an unseen force, a malevolent entity that had made this unholy sanctuary its own. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that this wasn't just a job. It was a descent into a forgotten darkness, a battle for his very soul. Mark's past mistakes, long buried under layers of regret and self-recrimination, began to resurface with a terrifying clarity in the oppressive gloom of the chapel. The entity, now keenly aware of his presence and vulnerability, seemed to feed on his guilt, twisting his memories into grotesque caricatures of his failures. He saw the faces of those he had disappointed, heard the echoes of harsh words spoken in anger, all magnified and distorted by the malevolent force that sought to break him. The entity's manipulation was insidious, preying on his deepest fears, whispering that he was unworthy, that his life was a testament to his shortcomings, and that redemption was an impossibility. It wasn't merely an attack on his body, but a relentless assault on his very soul, seeking to erode his will and leave him a hollow shell. Yet, amidst the torment, a strange realization began to dawn upon him. The chapel, with its ancient, faded symbols and its palpable sense of suffering, felt less like a lair of pure evil and more like a prison. He pictured the rough-hewn stone altar, the strange glyphs on the walls, and a new theory began to form. This wasn't just a place of dark rituals, it was where a victim of those very rituals had been trapped. The malevolent force wasn't necessarily the original perpetrator, but perhaps something that had attached itself to the residual pain and despair, feeding on it, holding a soul hostage. He felt a flicker of empathy, a connection to this unseen suffering. His own life had been marked by mistakes, by moments where he had felt trapped and alone. This shared sense of imprisonment ignited a spark of resolve within him. He knew with a certainty that transcended his fear that he had to free this trapped soul, whatever the personal cost. His own desire for redemption, long a dormant ember, now blazed into a determined flame. This was his chance, not just to escape, but to atone, to make a difference, even if it was for a spirit he couldn't see. He would face this malevolent force, not just for his own survival, but for the liberation of another. The confrontation in the chapel was not a physical brawl, but a battle of wills, a desperate struggle for dominance over the very essence of the place. Mark, drawing upon a newfound wellspring of courage, began to speak not to the malevolent entity, but to the trapped soul he sensed within the walls. He spoke of release, of peace, of the possibility of moving beyond the pain. The entity reacted with fury, lashing out with renewed intensity, throwing objects, manifesting chilling whispers that tried to drown out his words. But Mark stood firm, his voice trembling but unwavering, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. He ignored the icy tendrils that clawed at him, the phantom blows that struck his body. His focus was singular, to pierce through the layers of malice and reach the suffering spirit. In a moment of profound courage, a true sacrifice of self, Mark faced his fears head-on. He extended his hand, not physically but spiritually, offering comfort and release. He declared with all the conviction he could muster that the suffering was over, that the past could be forgiven, and that freedom was possible. It was a leap of faith, a moment where his own redemption became intertwined with that of the trapped soul. Then, as if a dam had broken, the oppressive weight in the chapel lifted. The malevolent presence recoiled, its power diminishing under the unwavering light of Mark's compassion. A brief, ethereal glow filled the room, a fleeting warmth that spoke of profound relief and gratitude. Then silence, a profound, peaceful silence that replaced the suffocating dread. The trapped soul was free. Mark collapsed onto the cold stone floor, utterly exhausted, his body aching, his mind reeling. But amidst the physical pain, there was an unfamiliar sense of lightness, a profound inner peace he hadn't felt in years. He had faced his demons, both internal and external, and emerged victorious. He had found a purpose beyond mere survival, a path to redemption. Yet, as he slowly pushed himself up, a lingering question gnawed at him. Was the evil truly vanquished or merely dormant, waiting for another unsuspecting soul to wander into its unholy sanctuary? The chapel felt clean, but the memory of its darkness would forever be etched in his mind. To save another, he had to confront the demons within himself. The silence that followed Mark's ordeal, while peaceful, carried an unsettling ambiguity, a hushed promise that the narrative of the funeral home was far from over. Its ancient walls, having witnessed so much, seemed to hold their breath, awaiting the next chapter in their grim history. And it arrived, not with a bang, but with the quiet precision of science embodied by Dr. Anya Sharma. Anya was a forensic pathologist, a woman whose world revolved around tangible evidence, logical deductions, and the cold, hard facts of biology. Her motivation was entirely scientific. She sought rational explanations for every anomaly, every deviation from the norm. Yet even her meticulously ordered world was about to be challenged in a way she could never have anticipated. She arrived at a newly built, state-of-the-art funeral home, a facility designed for efficiency and sterility. It was a stark contrast to the older, more character-filled establishments, seemingly immune to the lingering shadows of the past. The case was unusual from the outset. A body with no discernible cause of death. The deceased, a man in his late 40s, appeared perfectly healthy, yet his heart had simply stopped. This alone piqued Anya's professional curiosity, but as she began her examination, subtle anomalies began to surface, chipping away at her scientific certainty. The autopsy suite, usually a bastion of controlled environments, felt oddly temperamental. Her sophisticated equipment, typically flawless, experienced intermittent malfunctions. Lights flickered, monitors briefly went blank, and an inexplicable chill permeated the air, despite the room's regulated temperature. Anya, ever the pragmatist, attributed these disturbances to faulty wiring or perhaps a subtle electromagnetic interference she couldn't immediately identify. She meticulously documented every observation, her pen scratching across her notepad, each word a testament to her unwavering commitment to objective truth. However, as she delved deeper, the purely scientific explanations began to fray. Beneath the deceased's skin, almost imperceptible at first, she discovered a series of intricate, ancient symbols. They were not tattoos, but seemed almost etched into the very fabric of his being, as if they had grown from within. Her gloved fingers traced their delicate lines, a shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the room's fluctuating temperature. These were not modern designs. They spoke of a forgotten era, of beliefs long consigned to history books. Anya, driven by an insatiable intellectual curiosity, began to research the symbols. Her initial searches yielded little, but persistence led her down obscure academic rabbit holes into texts on ancient ethnography and forgotten spiritual practices. She finally found a match. The symbols were associated with ancient protection rituals used to ward off malevolent entities, but also, disturbingly, with curses designed to bind or imprison spirits. The duality of their meaning sent a jolt of unease through her. It was then, as she pored over the texts in the quiet of the autopsy room, that she heard it. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate directly within her own bones. It was a communication, not in words, but in pure, unfiltered emotion. A desperate plea laced with an undeniable urgency, a warning that chilled her to her core. It was a sensation entirely outside her realm of scientific understanding, yet utterly undeniable. This wasn't a hallucination. It was a connection, a message from something beyond her rational comprehension. Science had no answers for the chilling truth etched on the skin. Anya's scientific logic, once her unyielding anchor, now wrestled fiercely with the undeniable paranormal evidence that pulsed around her. The resonant hum had intensified, morphing into a cascade of images and feelings, a coherent narrative without a single spoken word. The deceased, she realized with a jolt that threatened to dislodge her composure, was not merely a victim. He was a messenger. The strange markings on his skin, which she had initially identified as ancient protective symbols, were indeed that, but they were also a desperate map, a final warning from a protective spirit. This was not a curse, but a shield, etched onto his very being to safeguard against something far more insidious. The entity communicating with her was not malevolent. It was the man himself, or rather, his lingering essence, trapped between realms, striving to convey an urgent truth. He had been a guardian, a keeper of ancient knowledge, and his death was not accidental. It was a breach, a consequence of a larger, malevolent force targeting the very fabric of the funeral home, seeking to exploit the thin veil between life and death that these places inherently possessed. This force, ancient and hungry, saw the facility not as a place of rest, but as a gateway, an unholy nexus through which it could manifest fully into the living world. The sterile modern design, ironically, made it more vulnerable, lacking the protective wards and sacred consecrations of older, more traditional establishments. Anya felt a surge of fear, but it was quickly overshadowed by a fierce determination. Her scientific training, which once demanded empirical proof, now spurred her to act on instinct and intuition. She raced against time, poring over the ancient texts once more, her mind now attuned to the subtle nuances she had previously dismissed. The symbols on the body were not just protective. They formed a ritual, a sequence of actions designed to reinforce the barrier between worlds. The deceased had started the ritual in life, a desperate attempt to fortify the defenses, but his death had interrupted it, leaving the gateway dangerously ajar. The air in the autopsy suite grew heavy, thick with a palpable dread. The lights flickered violently, and the sterile instruments rattled in their trays. A guttural growl, not human, not animal, echoed from the corners of the room, growing louder, more insistent. The malevolent force was attempting to breach, its presence a cold, suffocating weight that pressed down on Anya. She could feel its tendrils probing, seeking weaknesses, seeking entry. With trembling hands, Anya began to complete the ritual. She didn't understand the specifics of every ancient incantation, but she followed the visual cues from the texts, guided by the silent, urgent promptings of the protective spirit. She used the deceased's own blood, meticulously collecting it, and then, using a sterile scalpel, etched the final missing symbols onto the cold metal slab beside the body. She spoke words she didn't fully comprehend, ancient sounds that vibrated with power, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coiling in her gut. As the final symbol was completed, a blinding flash of light erupted from the slab, followed by a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The oppressive cold vanished, replaced by a sudden, profound stillness. The malevolent force had been repelled, its attempt to breach thwarted. The funeral home was safe for now. The protective spirit of the deceased, having finally completed its mission, faded, leaving behind only a faint, lingering warmth. Anya stood amidst the quiet, her heart pounding, her body trembling with exhaustion and a profound sense of awe. Her world had irrevocably shifted. No longer purely scientific, she now carried a new understanding, a profound awareness of the unseen forces that shaped reality. The veil between worlds, she realized, was far thinner than most imagined, especially in places of transition where the living bid farewell to the dead. And sometimes, the dead demanded to be heard, not with words, but with a chilling truth etched upon the very fabric of existence. Her life, dedicated to the tangible, now acknowledged the undeniable, the ethereal, and the terrifying beauty of what lay beyond the veil.